Do you find yourself wondering why, despite all your kindness, all your gentleness and empathy, you continue feeling empty, exhausted, and exploited? Why the more you sacrifice, the more people seem to take from you without acknowledgement? Why your compassion, instead of bringing satisfaction, seems to be slowly draining your soul? Friedrich Nietzsche, one of history's most misunderstood philosophers, predicted this. He called it slave morality. When virtue becomes poison, when kindness transforms into disguised weakness, when your compassion becomes the weapon others use against you. I'm about to explain why Nietzsche believed that this kind of kindness is not only self-destructive, but is fundamentally a symptom of resentment. Why the more you identify as a good person, the more you may be denying your own nature, and why this isn't mere abstract philosophy, but a precise diagnosis of the silent psychological epidemic consuming millions of people today. If you've been feeling guilty for wanting more, for desiring power, for harboring thoughts that aren't pure or altruistic, Nietzsche would say you're not sick. You're just beginning to awaken from the moral hypnosis that has suppressed your true potential. Here's what Nietzsche understood that explains everything. Morality as we know it isn't universal or divine. It's a historical construction created by those who were physically weak to control those who were strong. These aren't flaws in the system. They are the system, and it only works if everyone participates in the denial of their own vital instincts. The moment someone truly questions, not just intellectually but viscerally, why they should consider self-sacrifice a virtue, that person becomes a glitch in the moral matrix. They begin to see the guilt mechanisms that others use to manipulate them. They recognize the resentment disguised as virtue around them. They understand the moral power games everyone is unconsciously playing, and once you see this, you can no longer ignore it. Nietzsche lived this personally. As his consciousness expanded beyond the Christian morality of his time, he found normal moral conventions increasingly suffocating, not because he was immoral, but because he was awake in a civilization anesthetized by 2,000 years of life denial. Every conversation required him to pretend not to see what he saw, not to know what he knew, not to understand what was really happening beneath the surface of professed virtue. This is the curse of what Nietzsche called being beyond good and evil. You become psychologically isolated. Even when physically surrounded, you speak a different language, see different motivations, operate from a different reality, and the effort required to bridge this gap, to constantly translate between your perspective and the collective moral narrative, becomes exhausting. Thus, those who awaken to the illusion of traditional morality begin to pull away, not because they hate people, but because remaining in the lie requires them to betray their own vital nature. Each day demands they pretend that self-denial is freedom. Each social interaction asks them to diminish their strength. Each conventional relationship requires them to be less than they truly are. And eventually, the spirit says, enough. Free yourself. Preserve your vitality. Stop allowing the poison of herd morality to drain what you've worked so hard to reclaim. Nietzsche discovered that as you recognize your own impulses for power and mastery, common morality becomes unbearable to witness. You are seeing an entire civilization repressing its own life force while denying that this is happening. When you've confronted your own desire for power, watching others disguise theirs in false virtue becomes agonizing. When you've integrated your own will to power, seeing the hypocritical morality around you, the compassionate who secretly despise those they help, the tolerant who actually feel moral superiority, the humble who use their humility to manipulate, seems like watching mass psychosis, because that's exactly what it is. Nietzsche called this the burden of lucidity. The awakened person sees that most everyday morality is just disguised resentment. Holy wars are dominance impulses dressed as divine duty. Identity politics are often will to power hidden behind demands for justice. Moral outrage on social media is frequently a displaced expression of cruelty seeking socially acceptable targets. Once you see this, participation becomes almost impossible. You cannot join the moral crowd when you see that it's merely expressing the same impulses it condemns, only in disguised form. You cannot choose sides when you understand that both sides are pretending their desires for dominance are noble causes. You cannot engage in the farce of moral superiority when you recognize this as an inversion of true human instincts. So you begin to create your own values, not out of arrogance but out of psychological necessity. One of Nietzsche's readers expressed this perfectly. I used to pride myself on my compassion and altruism. Then I read Nietzsche and realized that my goodness was actually an expression of weakness and fear. I wasn't really kind. I was just trying to make others like me, feel morally superior, and avoid conflict. Now, when I observe moral behavior, I see people expressing their will to power in indirect and passive ways, while calling it virtue. I can no longer participate. It would be like voluntarily entering a collective illusion. But here's what's really happening. Those who have awakened from the moral hypnosis aren't just seeing through the facade, they're feeling the weight of this falsity. When you begin to affirm life in its totality, you become energetically sensitive to the life denial around you. Being surrounded by people who repress their vital instincts while pretending to transcend them is like suffering constant psychological violence. It's not judgment. It's a genuine energetic incompatibility. Nietzsche realized this in his own life. As he increasingly embraced his life-affirming philosophy, being in environments of conventional morality became almost unbearable, not because he despised people, but because he could feel the life denial circulating everywhere, the repression, the guilt, the forced virtue, all creating an atmosphere of sickness of which only he seemed aware. This is why people who overcome herd morality often first pull away from religious institutions and overly virtuous environments. These are the places where life denial is most intense, where resentment is most palpable beneath the mask of piety. For someone who has embraced the will to power, it's like being forced to watch people psychologically mutilating themselves while calling it goodness. Nietzsche's second great insight. Once you've embraced what he called amor fati, love of fate, the affirmation of all life including suffering, pretending conformity with common morality becomes impossible, and conventional society demands nothing less than the performance of goodness. Before awakening, you could play the moral games unconsciously, express outrage when expected, feign altruism when convenient, play the role of a good person, according to inherited definitions. But once you've touched the deeper truth beyond all moral masks, that life is will to power and nothing besides, returning to perform the moral farce feels like a death of spirit. Each conventional social situation demands moral performance. The persona of the virtuous citizen, the role of the good Samaritan, the identity of the morally outraged, the acceptable opinions, the appropriately compassionate emotions. For someone still identified with traditional morality, this seems natural. For someone who has awakened to the truth of life as Nietzsche saw it, this feels like a prison. Nietzsche discovered this through personal experience. After his break with conventions, he could no longer play the role of the respectable conventional professor. He couldn't pretend to agree with the collective moral opinions he saw as symptoms of decadence. He couldn't maintain relationships that required him to be false about human nature. So he withdrew to Sils Maria, in the Swiss mountains, where he could think authentically. This isn't antisocial, it's pro-authenticity. The awakened person isn't rejecting others out of arrogance but out of essential incompatibility. They've become too real for environments that demand falsity, too authentic for spaces that demand moral performance, too whole for a culture that accepts only moralized fragments of the human being. One of Nietzsche's early admirers, a successful lawyer who found Zarathustra, described the impossibility of return. I sit at gala dinners and meetings where everyone is performing their virtuous roles, saying what good people should say, condemning what good people should condemn. I can no longer do this. It's like being asked to pretend I'm a character in a poorly written morality play. My true self has no voice in those rooms. Only my moral persona did, and it is dead. He didn't leave dramatically. He disappeared quietly, transitioning over months, moving to a simpler life where he could be real instead of virtuous, not out of failure, but from the success of finding himself beyond good and evil. This is happening everywhere. The awakened are leaving careers that demand moral conformity, ending relationships based on expectations of conventional goodness, abandoning social circles that require appropriate expressions of virtue. They aren't failing society, they're succeeding in authenticity, and this success makes participation in the moral farce impossible. Here's what Nietzsche understood energetically. Maintaining fidelity to your will to power in an environment of life denial requires tremendous psychological energy, and the awakened people are realizing this isn't sustainable. Think about what the life-affirming person has to do in common moralistic society. Constantly filter expressions of resentment disguised as virtue, maintain boundaries against energy vampires who use goodness to control, translate between the language of life affirmation and the dialect of life denial, maintain your vital frequency while surrounded by anti-life forces, process not just your own impulses, but also the moralistic material everyone else is projecting. Nietzsche called this the great health, the invisible work that vitally conscious people do just to exist in spaces of sick morality. It's exhausting. Each interaction requires that you not react to moral hypocrisy, not absorb the idealistic poison, not be pulled into dramas of virtuous indignation, not match your frequency to the life denial around you, not betray your truth to maintain moral peace. For people still in the moral hypnosis, this isn't work. They're flowing with the collective current of life denial. For people who've awakened to the will to power, it's like swimming against the current in a tsunami of sick morality. Eventually, you have to get out of the water or drown. Nietzsche realized that his most lucid readers often developed what he called nausea, a profound unease with modern civilization, a weariness with moral falsity, a longing for cleaner air, not out of personal pathology, but from the exhaustion of maintaining lucidity in an environment of moralistic self-deception. The cure wasn't therapy, it was withdrawal from the poisoned environment. A woman, a teacher who awakened after reading Beyond Good and Evil, developed a profound aversion to the academic environment she once loved. Her investigations showed nothing externally wrong. Through introspection, she realized she was spending enormous energy maintaining her integrity while surrounded by colleagues and students who confused education with moral indoctrination. She wasn't sick, she was energetically depleted. When she left teaching and moved to a simpler life, her vitality returned within weeks. Not from rest, but from no longer having to maintain her authenticity against the constant pressure of decadent moral consensus. This is why awakened people pull away to nature, to solitude, to small communities of kindred spirits, not to escape responsibility, but to preserve the vitality they've worked so hard to reclaim. They understand that their life force is precious and finite, and spending it in interactions with people still hypnotized by conventional morality is like pouring rare wine into sand. Nietzsche identified this withdrawal as necessary, what he called the great detachment that every person in the process of overcoming must go through. Not permanently, but necessarily. The spirit requires solitude to integrate what society fragments with its moral obsession. The detachment phase isn't about misanthropy, it's about psychological necessity. When you're transforming at a fundamental level, from a being still trapped in categories of good and evil, to a creator of values, you need space away from influences that would pull you back into old moral patterns. You need silence to hear your own voice beyond the clamor of social approval. You need solitude to integrate without interference from expectations of goodness. Nietzsche went through profound phases of isolation. His years in Sils Maria weren't vacations, they were existential necessity. He needed distance from collective morality to develop his own table of values. He needed separation from expectations of virtue to understand his own depths beyond good and evil. This is what's happening with people who are now awakening from the moral dream. They aren't disappearing because they're selfish or immoral. They're following an existential pattern that transformation requires. The detachment period is when the will to power integrates without the social pressure to repress or sublimate it. The true self emerges without the demands of virtuous performance. The wisdom to create values arises without the external noise of inherited morality. The philosophical transformation completes without interruption. But here's what Nietzsche emphasized. Detachment isn't escape, it's preparation. The awakened person withdraws not to abandon humanity, but to develop something humanity desperately needs. They're gestating new values, integrating truths beyond good and evil, becoming what Nietzsche called free spirits, beings who have adapted their minds to philosophical altitudes others cannot reach. One of Nietzsche's early disciples, a physician, disappeared from professional life for 2 years. Everyone thought he had had a breakdown. In fact, he had a breakthrough. In solitude, he integrated insights about health and illness that would have been impossible while maintaining his conventional professional persona. When he returned, he brought a revolutionary approach that saw health not as absence of disease, but as abundance of life force. But these ideas could only emerge in detachment from the very system they would eventually transform. The detachment phase looks like withdrawal, but it's actually a deepening. The awakened person isn't running away. They're going deeper than moralizing society permits. They're doing the work that can only be done in solitude, developing the perspective that may eventually revitalize the collective, but only after it's fully formed. Nietzsche's final insight offers hope. Those who've detached don't stay away forever. But when they return, they come back differently, not to participate in life denial, but to offer new possibilities to those ready to receive them. The awakened who disappear are following what Joseph Campbell would later call the hero's journey: separation, initiation, return with gifts. But the return isn't to conventional society, it's to the margins, the edges, the spaces where value creation can exist without compromise to decadent morality. They become what Nietzsche called philosophers of the future, present but not conforming, available but not absorbed. They may return as artists creating from authentic depths, thinkers working with individuals ready to awaken, teachers sharing with small groups of emerging free spirits, writers offering maps for other souls liberating themselves from moral chains, guides for those beginning their own transvaluation of all values. But they never return to the moralizing mainstream. They cannot. Once you've transcended herd morality, You cannot pretend that categories of good and evil still contain you. Once you become conscious of the will to power, you cannot pretend that self-denial is virtue. Once you've found the path beyond good and evil, you cannot live from the poison of idealism. Nietzsche observed this pattern repeatedly. His true readers rarely returned to their previous lives. They created new ones, more authentic, more direct, more aligned with life affirmation. They found ways to contribute without sacrificing their vitality. They learned to influence without being corrupted by sick morality. A female reader, an artist who disappeared for 3 years after discovering Nietzsche, returned not to the conventional art world, but to work with a small group of creators, seeking expression beyond moral categories. She could no longer make art that pleased conventional moral sensibilities, only work with those who were experiencing the same liberation she had experienced. Her work was small in scale but immense in impact. She was invisible to conventional society, but was a vital source for those awakening from the dogmatic slumber of morality. This is the model. Awakened people disappearing from moralizing society, but reappearing in pockets of vitality, creating parallel structures, building alternatives, offering depth to those who seek it, while remaining invisible to those still content with life denial. Nietzsche believed this was evolution in action. Not everyone transcends herd morality simultaneously. The pioneers detach first, create new spaces, and then become beacons for the next wave. What appears as abandonment is actually architecture, building the structures that will sustain a post-moral mode of living when humanity is ready. Let me synthesize Nietzsche's complete vision of why spiritually awakened people are abandoning conventional morality. They can no longer tolerate the life denial that moralizing society promotes. Their authentic self cannot perform the good person persona that society demands. The energy required to maintain lucidity in spaces of moral self-deception becomes unsustainable. They enter the necessary detachment phase that transformation requires. They eventually return, but only to spaces where new values can be created, not to centers of conventional morality. This detachment isn't failure, it's evolution. It's not weakness, but strength, not abandonment, but philosophical necessity. The awakened are following a pattern as old as philosophy itself. Separation, transformation, transformative return. Society experiences this as loss, as moral betrayal. Where have all the good people gone? Why are the most noble voices growing quieter? Why are the morally reliable abandoning the herd when it most needs moral reinforcement? But Nietzsche would say, they aren't abandoning humanity, they're preparing something for it. In their detachment, they're developing what the collective consciousness isn't yet ready to receive. In their distance, they're creating spaces for others to liberate themselves too. In their silence, they're gestating words that the collective, hypnotized by morality, cannot yet hear. If you're feeling the need to pull away from conventional goodness, Nietzsche would want you to know, this isn't immorality or selfishness, it's philosophical necessity. Your consciousness has developed to a point where participating in the collective moral hypnosis is no longer possible without betraying the life in you. The detachment you're feeling isn't antisocial. It's necessary. You aren't abandoning others. You're following the path of the free spirit that every transforming person must tread. You aren't evil for no longer being able to tolerate conventional goodness. You're simply awakening. And awakening requires different conditions than moral dreaming. Allow yourself detachment, not forever, but for now. Find your Sils Maria, whether in physical solitude or psychological distance. Stop spending your vitality on moralizing interactions. Stop performing for audiences who cannot see beyond good and evil. Stop translating your depth into terms acceptable to common moral sensibility. Your detachment isn't selfish. It's necessary. Humanity needs people who completely transcend morality more than it needs more guardians of established values. It needs creators more than conservators, authenticity more than performative virtue, life affirmation more than moral conformity. And when you return, if you return, you'll bring gifts that could only be developed in detachment. You'll offer what couldn't be offered while maintaining false belonging to the moral herd. You'll speak truths that couldn't be spoken while playing the role of a good person. Free spirits are disappearing because that's what the transvaluation of all values requires. Not permanently, but necessarily. Not out of hatred, but out of love for life. Love for truth beyond good and evil. Authentic will to power. A love that says, I must become who I am, even if it means being alone. Nietzsche would say, detach consciously, withdraw with purpose, use your solitude phase for integration, not for resentful isolation, and remember, your detachment is preparing something vital. You aren't abandoning humanity, you're pioneering the way to where it will eventually need to go when it's ready to leave herd morality behind. If you're detaching or feeling the need to free yourself from categories of good and evil, subscribe to this channel where I explore Nietzsche's insights. for those walking the path of transvaluation. Watch the video on your screen now about the will to power and how to use it for creation, not destruction. Remember, your detachment from conventional morality isn't abandonment of humanity, it's evolution, and the world needs individuals beyond good and evil more than it needs more moralizing sheep in the herd.